Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Just before we make a start, just in terms of some housekeeping, could someone please confirm that you can hear and see me before I start speaking to an empty room? You should have the ability in the chat box or in the question box to do that. So we can see Simon at least can see me. Can anybody else? Just a little bit more confirmation. Perfect, thank you very much. So just on that note, you might see me looking up and down on several occasions. That's because I am keeping an eye on the chat box. If you've got any questions as we go along, my preferred way to do these things is to do the questions as and when. So if I'm talking about what defined cost is a little bit later on, put your questions in the box, please, and I'll address them as I go. Aside from that, I have one final note here from Heather at the institution. This recording will be uploaded to YouTube. That's the way that the CICES are doing these things moving forward. So stay tuned for that in the next couple of weeks or so. But aside from that, just to introduce myself, first of all, my name is William. I was originally a civil engineer by trade, and I've since cross-qualified as a solicitor. So I'm a technical guy that now does the law. And one of the areas that I specialise in is the NEC form of contract, which is what we're here to learn about today. I'm also a practicing adjudicator, so I sit on the Institution of Civil Engineers, the ICE panel of adjudicators, and that would be one of my specialisms, is resolving disputes in that decision maker role under the NEC form of contract. We've got plenty to get through this afternoon, so I'm not going to give you any more of a sales pitch, but if you do want to get in contact, there's my email address, and it'll be at the end as well. So, as I say, we have got a bucket load of slides to get through here in this short 1 hour period, so we'll get straight in. So I'm going to start this presentation by covering some preliminary points. So making sure that you first of all check your contract, because what we're covering here today is under the NEC 4 engineering and construction contract in its unamended form. So you always need to make sure that whenever you're using this lesson in real life, that you check to see if your contract has been amended in any way, or alternatively, if you're using one of the other forms of NEC contract. So we'll touch on that briefly. The next point, which goes hand in hand with the first one, is also be conscious that the NEC was published, and NEC 4 that is, was published in 2017, but it has been amended on 3 occasions since then. So depending on when you bought your NEC contract, it might be slightly different to the one that was published in 2017. There are plenty of amendments that are not worth talking about for the purposes of today. They touch on other areas of the contract, but there are some of them that touch on the compensation event mechanism that are worth noting, and I'll point those out. And then finally, a part that I'll talk about in a little bit of detail is the fact that the NEC is more than just a contract. Again, people think the new engineering contract is just a set of T's and C's. It's not. It has a suite of project management tools built into the terms themselves that require the parties to administer the contract to manage it on a proactive basis. And the compensation event mechanism is part of that. It requires the parties to have difficult conversations as they go along. It requires the parties to administer the program in a very specific way with the aim of avoiding disputes at the end of the project. All of that's built into the contract. It's more than just an agreement to build an asset. It's an agreement that also has PM at its forefront, project management at its forefront. I'll then briefly touch on the compensation event mechanism in fairly general terms, just to explain to people who are perhaps slightly new to the NEC. We could spend, days talking about this if you want to go into the full detail. I'm just going to skim over it to give you a broad brush understanding about how the NEC compensation event mechanism works. And then finally, what you're all here for, we're going to conclude by reference to a worked example to make all of this real, to put it into practice. So, getting stuck in, I'm going to be getting through the first couple of slides here quite quickly. So if you are going to get nauseous with these slides moving about, you have been forewarned. So the first point that I mentioned is always to check your contract. So for the purposes of today, our worked example is based on this one. It's based on the engineering and construction contract. And specifically, I'm looking at option A of this form. That is only relevant for the purposes of choosing the schedule of cost components. And I'll explain what that is a little bit later on. But apart from that individual point, broad brush purposes, the compensation event process is the same under all of the options of this very commonly used NEC contract. And finally, I'm looking at this in its unamended form. As the case may be, I will touch on a few parts of the mechanism that I often see amended as a construction solicitor and as an adjudicator, but for the purposes of the slides themselves, everything that you see here is unamended. The final points that I have there, if you are a subcontractor in the audience, don't be panicking, because this contract is virtually identical to the subcontract form of the NEC. Particularly when it comes to compensation events, they're virtually back to back. The only point maybe worth noting there is that the notification period when it comes to notifying a compensation event is 7 weeks under the subcontract, as opposed to 8 weeks under the main contract, to allow the main contractor to pass things up the way. If you are a consultant and you're working under the professional services form of the NEC, the one with an orange cover, it's very different. It's very different because you're not going to be working with plant and materials or equipment. The compensation event mechanism under the professional services agreements are all based on time charge. They're all based on people costs. So it is a bit different in that regard, but the mechanism itself is the same. It has to be notified. You then go and assess it in a very particular and calculated way. And then finally, if you're working in real life, the biggest point to note here is this one, because in real life, you will never see this contract in its unamended form. I've never seen it used totally unamended. I got very close once with a client of mine in Surrey or Sussex, and there was only one Z clause, but again, I've never seen one that is fully unamended. And quite often you'll see amendments to the topic we're looking at today, which is the compensation event process or mechanism. So always, always, always check your contract, which is what this slide is all about. The next point to make is on the NEC 4 official amendments. So as I said previously, the NEC contract was first published in June 2017. Doesn't feel that long ago, but yeah, coming on 6 years at this point, or 6 years past. But since then, there has been 3 sets of official amendments published to the NEC suite of contracts. In January 2019, we had a change to clause 63.5. Just as a general note, you can find all of these amendments for free on the NEC website. If you type into Google NEC 4 amendments January 2019, you can download them for free. This was a key change. It goes into the clause of the contract that assesses the impact on the programme or the time impact of a compensation event, and brings forward some best practice from a series of practice notes that were also published by the NEC 4 at the time. So that's a very positive change, and it will help the parties administer the compensation event process when there's lots of different compensation events happening at the same time. So that is a good change. There is nothing relevant here for the purposes of assessing compensation events in the October 2020 amendments. They touched on a couple of amendments to do with case law that was coming through in the UK at that time, but nothing touching on the compensation event process. And then we had one earlier this year where the definition or the first item within the schedule of cost components was altered slightly to allow contractors and consultants to claim their people costs whenever those people were working from home. Under the standard NEC 4 contract, as it was published back in 2017, you could only recover the costs of people for the time spent within the working areas. But given what happened since 2017, the way that we work is now very different, and the NEC drafters have now updated that to say that you can also recover staff time or people costs when they are working from home, if they are normally working within the working areas. So the likes of a site engineer who normally works within the working areas, but who now happens to work from home 1 day a week, that time can also be recovered. But aside from that, no whole-scale changes since the contract was published in 2017. A couple of questions here that I'll deal with briefly. Do the amendments apply to the contracts executed by the parties prior to the date? No, Callum, they don't. These amendments will only apply if they are written in to Contract Data Part 1. So the first paragraph, Contract Data Part 1, will say what the conditions of contract are, and the standard drafting is that the conditions of contract are the engineering and construction contract 2017. If you want to incorporate these amendments, you need to go in and change that to say as amended by Jan 19, October 20, etc. Good question. The next preliminary point then, which really does go to the heart of what we're looking at here this afternoon, is the fact that the NEC contract is more than just a contract. Again, it's a project management system. That is what this contract is, and it is what makes the NEC different from its competitors or its contemporaries. In terms of what those project management tools are, first of all, we have the early warning mechanism, clause 15, that enshrines and obliges the parties to early warn risks. Something that's got the propensity to affect time, cost, or quality is what it effectively boils down to. Both parties are obliged to early warn that, to have an early warning meeting, and to discuss it. Come up with ways that bring about a benefit to all. You're not talking about blame at that point. You're coming up with solutions to potential problems, to perhaps avoid risks materializing. You can do that under any other form of contract. FIDIC, which now has an early warning mechanism, was brought in recently. JCT, RIAI, RIBA, all of these other forms of contract, you can do this if you want to, but where the NEC is different is it obliges the parties to do it. And if a contractor doesn't give an early warning that an experienced contractor should have, then there is a repercussion for that. And I'll touch on that probably in the last slide today. The next project management tool at your disposal is the program, which is commonly referred to as the beating heart of the NEC. And the reason the program is so important is because you use the accepted program to assess the impact of compensation events. Just like before, under any other form of contract, you can write in a programming requirement if you want to. But the difference with the NEC is it uses that program as an integral part of the change management systems, the compensation event process. So if you're not on top of the program as you go along, it's going to create difficulties. I would say, in my experience as a dispute resolver and party representative, this is where the NEC goes wrong. Not getting the program correct, it being rejected by the project manager not giving enough reasons to explain why, and then there's never an accepted program in place. You've lost all of that contractual machinery that allows you to assess compensation events properly and robustly. And it takes you back to using a traditional form of contract. And why do you not just sign a JCT at that point? And then the final project management tool here is the compensation event mechanism. I'm calling it a project management tool because it's got very strict timelines associated with it. There's a requirement to notify within 8 weeks. There's a requirement for the project manager to respond within 1 week. There's mechanisms in place to set out what happens if they don't do that. The whole thing is particularized so that you know exactly what you have to do and when. It's designed to help you manage this rather difficult process. And I say difficult in the sense that it can be quite contentious. There can be quite a lot of friction there. And the point is, the NEC has these at its forefront. And if you're not using them correctly, you might as well use something else. The whole benefit that you get from the NEC is using those 3 mechanisms. That's what makes the NEC different. And it's not a contract, it's more than a contract. So just to illustrate that point before we move on, and this is what a traditional project looks like. You have this time versus effort process. And this is just my way of visualizing what a traditional contract looks like compared to a well-run NEC contract. So the traditional form, you have this duration where the parties tend to bury their head in the sand. They're instructing various different changes to the works, there's access issues, there's problems in the ground, and the parties don't deal with that proactively. They leave it all to the end of the project, and at that stage you have this war or this battle over the final account on the project. And the difficulty with that approach of burying your head in the sand for the majority of the duration is that resolving that final account war is going to cost you a fortune. Let's put numbers on that: hundreds of thousands on legal fees, the same again on experts, adjudicators' fees, the softer things that people often forget about, the time that your site team is not doing their job. They're now being tied up with the lawyers drafting witness statements. All of this time you haven't been paid. It's going to create cash flow problems. You might have to go to a financial institution like a bank and get loans to bridge the gap. All of that costs money, especially with interest rates doing what they're currently doing. Even softer again, waking up in cold sweats at director level. You know, this is your business on the line at this point. Depending on what way this goes, you know, your business could be under or it could be in profit. Again, all of those problems are associated with traditional forms of contract. And it's that problem that the NEC really does try to resolve by enshrining this project management principle or principles within it. So to compare that with the NEC, you have all of these little difficult conversations as you go along. Instead of leaving it to the end, you know, these are difficult conversations about compensation events. They will not be easy, but the theory is you're better having those small little battles as you go along to avoid the war at the end of the project, because, you know, you're still talking about the same issues here. This resource spike could still be dealing with the same 4 issues, but because the egg has been scrambled at this point, the only people that can unpick it are the lawyers, and the person that's ultimately going to decide it is an adjudicator if it's under the NEC in the first instance, or potentially a judge or an arbitrator. So have those conversations as you go along, and that's where you get the benefit of using the NEC. So to summarize all of that in a bit of a silly way, the NEC is designed to prevent the egg from being scrambled. That's the easiest way that I can describe this. All of these tools at your disposal are designed to help the project run more smoothly. That's why people use the NEC contract as opposed to one of its competitors. So, are there any questions on that just before I move on? Appreciate we got through that relatively quickly. I want to get on to the work example as soon as possible, but are there any questions just before I move to the next part? Good. So in terms of a brief whistle-stop tour of how the compensation event mechanism works, starting point is to look at clause 61.1. And this is the same clause throughout all of the NEC contracts. Doesn't matter if it's a subcontract, consultancy form, or the one we're looking at today, which is the ECC. And that clause of the contract will house all of the compensation events, well, the vast majority of them anyway. Under the standard ECC contract, there are 21 compensation events, but there are a few more depending on what secondary options you're using and what main option you're using. So for example, if you're using option B, there's a couple more within clause 60.4, etc., to do with the fact that you're using a bill of quantities. If you're using X2, for example, that makes a change in the law, a compensation event, and there's another compensation event under X15 to do with design. Again, depending on how you've tailored your contract, there might be a few more, but for broad brush purposes, most of the CEs exist at clause 60.1. In terms of what a compensation event is then at its core, it is simply an event that the contractor is not deemed to have made a program allowance for or priced. In other words, it's an employer risk, something that, if it happens, will entitle the contractor to claim an extension of time, if there is an impact on the program, that is, critical impact on the program, and the defined cost associated with that, in other words, the money. So that's what a compensation event is at its core, something that the contractor is not priced nor allowed for within its program. That, however, is subject to what we're about to discuss on the next slide. So there's one thing you have to do before you will be entitled to that extension of time or to that change in the prices. And that's when it comes into notification. So for the purposes of notifying compensation events, it's important to understand that, broadly speaking, there are 2 different types of compensation event. There are compensation events, which are, as I would say, project manager or supervisor led. So for example, an instruction to change the scope, that comes from the project manager, and then issuing a certificate of takeover early, again, that's something that comes from the project manager. Again, those types of compensation event are separate and distinct from everything else. The likes of physical conditions, it's got nothing to do with the project manager. The likes of weather conditions or a weather event, it's got nothing to do with the project manager. So generally speaking, they break down into those two different broad categories. And the reason it's important to draw a distinction between those two categories is because the contract treats them differently when it comes to notification. The first category, because they're led by the project manager or the supervisor, they have to be notified by the project manager. Everything else has to be notified by the contractor. So that's why it's important to look at those two separate categories. And to go one step further than that, the second category is subject to what we call a time bar, or to give it its fancy legal phrase, a condition precedent. It's something you have to do, notify in this case, before you are entitled to something else, getting a change to the program or getting your money effectively. And for that second category, they are subject to an 8-week time bar. So if you stumble across physical conditions or a weather event takes place, contractor, because that's not something that's to do with the PM, you have to notify it within 8 weeks. If you don't, then you will lose your entitlement. That's as simple as that. The courts in the UK or other jurisdictions that are applying English law, they will uphold these clauses. These condition precedent clauses, if they're drafted correctly, if they specify the exact time frame and they set out exactly what will happen if you don't give the notice, then the courts will enforce them. And the common consensus is that clause 61.3 of the NEC is a valid and binding and enforceable condition precedent. So that's why it's important to understand the two different types of compensation event, because one of them is subject to that very important time bar. So in terms of moving on to the next steps, we've notified a compensation event at this point. We need to then understand how do we assess it, both in terms of the time impact and the money impact. So I've tried to illustrate this here with a very simple diagram to explain how it works, and then we'll build upon this once we start to look at our little worked example. So under the NEC, it's all about what we call the planned completion date. And the terminology here is a little bit difficult and it's a little bit confusing. But the key thing is to understand that there is the completion date, capital C, capital D. That's a defined term under the NEC, and that is the contractual deadline. That is the date that will be stated in the contract data, and you sign up to delivering the job by that date, the capital C, capital D completion date. So let's say here, contractors signed up to finish the job by the 1st of October. This date is different. This is when the contractor plans to finish the works, or to give it its NEC phrase, plans to achieve completion. And this is when the terms start to look rather similar, but they are two different things. Completion is a separate term under NEC. To use language from other contracts, practical completion is the same concept, or substantial completion is the same concept. It's when you've done everything that the contract requires you to do. And what the NEC requires you to show is the date that you anticipate, or the date that you plan to achieve completion, or practical completion, to use another phrase. And the important thing is, by showing that date of planned completion, under NEC you create what's known as terminal float. So this period of float between when the contractor plans or they think they will finish and when they have to finish, that period of time is terminal float, and it is owned by the contractor. So let's look at what happens if there is a delay on this project. So let's say we have this 1 week delay during the program of works, which is now causing the contractor to finish 1 week later than they had anticipated. Okay, so the first thing you have to do here is look to see who is to blame. What is the cause of this delay? Is it something which is due to the contractor's own issues? For example, a subcontractor going insolvent, or not being able to place an order on time and therefore you've lost your factory slot and it's going to cause delay, or your labourers not turning up again. All of those problems are the contractor's risk. And the point is, if that is what is causing the delay, it eats into the contractor's terminal float and starts to use it up. And that's exactly what that terminal float is for. It's designed to be a buffer to allow the contractor to deal with those risks that lie with it. However, and as you can see here, the 1 month terminal float then turns into 3 weeks for obvious reasons. What, however, if this issue is down to a compensation event? The case is different here. So we now have this 1 week delay. Let's say it is to do with additional works that have been instructed, an instruction to change the scope, or not being given access, or physical conditions, as we've mentioned before. Then you have to go and apply the contract to determine the impact on the overall completion date. And the way that you do that is by moving out the completion date based on the impact to the planned completion date. So as you can see here, this 1 week of delay has caused the planned completion date to move by 1 week. And because the planned completion date is impacted by 1 week, you move the overall completion date by the same amount. And what that does is, by moving them both by the same duration, it preserves the contractor's terminal float. So they've now moved it out by 1 week, and that 1 month terminal float is preserved. That means that the contractor still has that period of time available to deal with its own issues if they ever arise. So after this compensation event's been implemented, let's say the contractor is then delayed by a subcontractor not turning up, it would have this buffer period to be able to deal with that risk which lies with the contractor. That is different to most other forms of contract. Most other forms of contract don't give the contractor the terminal float, and it's whoever gets there first. So the NEC is slightly more contractor friendly in that regard. I wouldn't even say that's the right way of describing it. I think this is the right way of doing it. I don't necessarily think it's more friendly. It is the right way. Contractor has diligently allowed terminal float. They should own the terminal float, in my opinion. So that's what planned completion is all about. Couple of quick questions just on this one. Daniel Scott, what about if there's TRA, time risk allowance, built into the program? So good question, there absolutely should be. So let's say here the contractor has built in some time risk allowance into some of these activities. Time risk allowance is the difference between how long you think the activity will take and how long you actually show for it. So if you think, installing the piles will take 6 weeks and you show 8 weeks, that 2 weeks at the end is your terminal float. Then the point is, if you don't end up needing that time risk allowance, your planned completion date is going to move back the way. And that's totally fine. The planned completion date should move. It should be a fairly fluid target as you go throughout the works. And if you're beating your program by not needing the time risk allowance, then all the power to you, Daniel. Your planned completion date should be moving. I'll take one final question here. Joe, what about when there's time risk allowance against an activity? I've actually just answered that there, Joe. There's a question there from Shahid. What camp would the clause 60.118 event fall into, which is a breach of contract by the employer? If it's time barred, is that conclusive? That is one of the events that can be time barred, Shahid, because it's not one of the events that's driven by the project manager. The exception to the time bar is very clearly laid out within clause 61.3 and says it only will not apply if it's a project manager led event, and goes into a bit more detail on what that is. The clause 60.118 event is led by the employer, and it is not carved out of that time barring provision. And the case law suggests that it would support that position as well. Good. So for the interest of time, we'll move on a little bit, and for the questions I haven't got back to, we will come back to them at the end. So that's all about the time impact of a compensation event. Let's now look at the cost impact. And the terminology here is a little bit difficult. I remember when I was first learning about the NEC back at university, and this whole concept of defined cost plus fee was a little bit foreign. It's not something that's, I think, immediately obvious, but hopefully this one slide will start to break that down so that everybody can understand it. So the way that this works is the NEC has a 3 or 4 page document, depending on which main option you're using, at the back of the contract, which is a separate document altogether, and it is called the Schedule of Cost Components. So if I quickly zoom in here, you can see that I've sort of screen grabbed a copy of that and put it onto this slide. And that's what it looks like. It's a 3-page document full of text, and it's an important document to pick up and read from time to time in full. What that Schedule of Cost Components is in essence a list of absolutely everything that the contractor is entitled to claim directly. So it will set out what they can claim in terms of their people costs. So if you're trying to recover your time as a QS and you want to put that within the compensation event quotation, you need to go and look at the Schedule of Cost Components and see if you are described on that list. If you're trying to recover the costs of a digger on site, or a dumper, or a roller, or a site office, again, all of these things, if you want to be able to recover that, it has to be on the list. And if you go and you read that list carefully, you will understand what exactly I mean by that. It describes all of the different costs that can be recovered. Again, plant and material, subcontractors, etc. Goes into detail on each of those heads of cost, and ultimately you then go and put your costs against those headings. So that's what the Schedule of Cost Components is. It's a separate document that is worth reading in full. So for example, you've picked up your Schedule of Cost Components and you've determined that your people costs are 5 grand, your equipment costs are 15, and your plant material costs are 30. So your total defined cost here is £50,000. So when people talk about, change in defined cost, they're talking about the impact of your costs looking at the Schedule of Cost Components. And we're going to really go into this in detail towards the back end of this session. So that's how you assess the change associated with a compensation event. It's looking at the impact on your defined cost. The second part of that, and again, you don't stop there. The second part is to go on and work out what we call the resulting fee. This bit is very straightforward under NEC 4. It used to be a lot more complicated under NEC 3 because there was lots of different percentages, etc. Whereas NEC 4, you simply have what's known as the fee percentage. And that percentage will be stated within Contract Data Part 2. For easy mathematics, I've assumed here that it's 10%. Again, what that percentage is depends on what sort of works you're doing. A percentage for civil engineering will be very different to structural. At subcontractor and specialist subcontract level, it'll be very different, it'll be much higher. But here you can see, assuming that it's 10%, that means that the fee is £5,000. And that £5,000 is deemed to have captured everything that is not part of your defined cost. For example, profit. You will not find profit on the list of cost components. It's not within the Schedule of Cost Components. Therefore, it is deemed to be within the fee. So that fee percentage has to capture everything outside of the Schedule of Cost Components. And once you've done that, it's a simple case of adding them both together, and that will give you the value then of your compensation event. So look at the Schedule of Cost Components, work out how much it cost you based on everything that's on that list, then multiply the sum total of that previous exercise by your fee percentage, and that will give you the ultimate cost of the compensation event, which is the defined cost plus the fee. Couple of questions here. Callum Smith, a long one. When recovering the contractor's cost of pricing the compensation event, does this apply to the time associated with a QS, or they're discussing their quotation with a PM or planner? So the contract doesn't go into that level of detail, Callum, and the first thing I will note is under NEC 4 you can recover the cost of preparing the quote. Under NEC 3 you couldn't do that, so that's a particular point to note. And the other point I would note, Callum, is that the QS's costs are only recoverable if they're working within the working areas. So if they're working in a head office, working on compensation event quotes, and that head office is not part of the working areas, then they wouldn't be recoverable. But aside from that, as long as they can prove on the balance of probabilities what they're spending their time doing, then it should be recoverable. So they'd have to go and prove that they were discussing it, timesheets and all that good stuff to ultimately prove it. There's a question there from Matthew Donnelly: is the contractor's risk included in the fee percentage? No. So when it comes to pricing a compensation event, you are entitled to take into account a risk allowance, and you would show that within the build-up of your defined cost itself. So for example, and this will be the last question before I move on, let's say a compensation event arises and you don't know whether it's going to take 2 weeks to do the work or 3 weeks to do the work. What would a sensible contractor do in that scenario? Which one would they allow for within the quote? I'll not insult anybody's intelligence, but clearly the 3 weeks. And that risk pot, that extra risk pot, Matthew, would be recovered as part of the people costs here, because you've allowed for an extra week of running cost effectively. So that's where you would build in the risk there, and the contract allows you to do that. It's clause 63.9, 63.8 or 63.9 that says exactly that, and we'll touch on that a little bit later on. Good. So for the purposes of time, we'll get stuck in then to our worked example to start making all of what we've just covered a little bit more real. So in terms of this worked example, I'm basing it on the option A of the NEC 4 engineering and construction contracts, and let's assume that the works in question are refurbishment works of a multi-story car park. It's a case I worked on a number of years ago, or probably even less. So in terms of the basic overview of what's happening here, we have our mobilization, contractors going in to break out the existing concrete. They're going to install some cathodic protection to protect the rebar. Again, that's the point of this project. They're going to pour new concrete over the top, and then they're going to put a nice asphalt surface on top. That's, broadly speaking, what the construction process is here. And as you can see, the contractor diligently is planning to finish the job well ahead of the deadline. So we have this period of terminal float here. Tangential to that, and in addition to those works, we also have some other works carrying out at the same time. We've got strip out works, we've got an M&E install, and we're installing a new ticket machine, so the barriers and that sort of thing. All of this is separate, it's not on the critical path, and as you can see here, all roads lead to Rome, and the contractor still plans to complete the works well in advance of the completion date. So, as we talked about before, we have this period of terminal float, and the key thing to understand when we start to look at this compensation event is you're not looking at the impact on this date, you're looking at the impact on this one. How much delay was caused to the planned completion date? If it's a 1 month delay to the planned completion date, then you move out the deadline, the completion date, by 1 month. Again, I'll make apologies on behalf of the NEC. Those terms are very similar, but they are very different. One is when the contractor plans to finish the job. The other is when they must. For the purposes of completion, we've got a few other types of float here. We've got free float. So let's say a compensation event arose here where the specification of the ticket machine was changed. That's not going to have an impact on program until it starts to bump up against the planned completion date. It starts to be the critical path activity at that point. Because there's free float in this activity, the compensation event would eat into that free float. So it's, you could be delayed all the way up to this point, and there would still be no impact on planned completion. You're only talking about costs at that point, and because there's free float in the activity. And the final point that we mentioned earlier is time risk allowance. So the contractor will naturally build float into its program. They think pouring the concrete is going to take 4 weeks, but they actually show 5. That 1 extra week at the end is your TRA. And if it's on the critical path and you don't end up using your time risk allowance, as I said before, that will start to move you back the way in terms of your planned completion date. Or if the opposite happens, if the 1 week time risk allowance isn't enough and this activity ends up taking 7 weeks, then your planned completion date would move. Again, it should be a fairly fluid target throughout the project. So in terms of the next thing to realize here, or to make sure is in place, is to get your accepted programs agreed as you go along. So let's say here, for instance, the contractor has been diligently supplying its program submissions, and the project manager has been happy with those and has been accepting them as you go along. That makes this exercise that we're about to look at much easier. If you don't have an accepted program in place at all, who has to assess the program here? It's the project manager. And you can be sure as damn it that the contractor is not going to agree with the project manager's assessment of the program. Project managers don't want to do it either. They are not programming experts. They don't want to go away to have to work out how the contractor plans to do it. That creates work for them that perhaps they're not even being paid for because they're on a fixed fee. It doesn't help anybody. What helps everybody under an NEC contract is if you can work together to get these programs agreed as you go along. And there should be really nothing to stop you doing that. If the contractor is showing the job finishing late, that is not grounds to reject the program. That is, you should be accepting it at that point. And it's a good thing to accept it at that point, because at least then you know that the project is in delay and you can try to work with one another to come up with a mitigation strategy. What you should not do is bury your head in the sand. Remember that slide from earlier? That's when the lawyers will get involved to try to unscramble that egg. So keep your eggs in separate pots by making sure you get the accepted programs in place. So this is the scenario that we're about to look at. The contractor, just before they start to pour the concrete, has realized that there is an issue with the design detail. So they've looked at the drawings, they're about to go and do the work, and they realize that there's a problem. And the problem here is the fact that there is no waterproofing membrane shown to the top side of the concrete deck. So concrete deck would normally have the waterproofing on top, and then you would put the asphalt surfacing on top of that. Again, you waterproof the concrete to stop the water percolating through it. I'm sure most of you will probably appreciate that. But the problem is that detail is wrong. There is no waterproofing membrane, and the contractor realizes that. So that's the scenario that we're in here. So first question I'll ask here is, what should the contractor do at this point? They've realized that this detail is wrong. This is a detail I pulled off Google. I'm pretty sure it's not even in English or in any language for that matter. So don't read into that. But what should the contractor do? Joseph, absolutely, they should early warn it. And I'll touch on what will happen later if they don't. So this is a prime example of something that should be early warned. So they should do just that, give an early warning. There's template drafting. It doesn't have to be any more complicated than that. Dear sir or madam, there is no waterproofing detail on this drawing. This could impair the performance of the works in use, as water could seep through the concrete decks. It doesn't have to be overcomplicated. You don't have to get bogged down in a contractual language quagmire. You can leave it at that. Is there a compensation event at this point? Anybody? Just been early warned. Joseph, Matthew, no, there's not. The contractor has just issued an early warning to say that there's potentially a problem here. For all the contractor knows, that's what the client wants. They want to go ahead without a waterproofing membrane. It'd be silly to do that, but you never know. So no, there is no compensation at this point. Moving on then, what should the project manager do in response to that early warning notice given by the contractor? What do we reckon? For the purposes of time, I'll tell you the answer. Risk reduction meeting, NEC 3 language, the NEC 4 version of that early warning meeting, same thing. Exactly that. They should enter the matter on the early warning register as part of the course. They should instruct an early warning meeting, possibly bringing along the structural engineer. So you have the power to bring along others to an early warning meeting. Seek solutions, update the register as required, and ultimately decide whether or not an instruction has to be given here to resolve this problem. And if they do want to give that instruction, it should be given when they are revising the early warning register. In other words, within 1 week of the early warning meeting. So, is there a compensation event at this point? Let's assume that the project manager has instructed a change to the detail. They've told the contractor to install the membrane as per the revised drawing. Is it a compensation event there? It absolutely is. It's a 60.11 change to the scope, compensation event at that point. So that's exactly what's happened here. The project manager has issued that instruction changing the detail. That's a compensation event under the contract, and we start to get into the compensation event process at that point. So let's assume, for the purposes of our example, that that instruction is given before any of the work is done, which is the best case scenario. It means that there's no abortive work. Contractor noticed it well in advance of pouring the concrete and was able to get it resolved properly. That's what the NEC is all about, and resolves the parties getting into difficulties by starting the work before the detail was resolved. As I said before, who notifies this compensation event? It depends on what category it falls into. This is one of these compensation events that is driven by the PM. So project manager should be the person that notifies this compensation event. For the purposes of your notes, I've set out the relevant clauses that say just that, clause 61.1. If the project manager fails to notify it, or if it's one of those other types of compensation event, then it will be up to the contractor to notify it. But in this case, because it's something that should have been notified by the PM, it will never be subject to that 8-week time bar. And there's that wording that I mentioned earlier to someone that raised a question. And that final paragraph at the bottom of clause 61.3, that's where you see the little carve out there that says the 8-week time bar does not apply to compensation events that arise from the PM or the supervisor giving an instruction, notification, certificate, or changing an earlier decision. So that's where the carve out from that condition precedent or time bar clause comes from. So for the purposes of our example, let's assume that Mr. or Mrs. PM has notified its instruction as a CE. We've got a really competent project manager in this job, and they have also instructed the contractor to go away and to provide a quotation, which takes us into the next step of the process. So when it comes to assessing this compensation event for the purposes of providing a quotation, my advice to people is always to start with looking at the impact on the program. You know, people tend to jump into the money, but if you start with the program, it makes looking at the money easier. So start with the program is my advice. And the relevant clause for that is clause 63.5. This is the extension of time provision under the NEC form of contract effectively. As I mentioned before, this clause was amended back in January of 2019. So it was one of the earlier amendments. So just make sure that you're looking at the most up-to-date version of that. So looking at the impact here of this new design detail, let's assume that the contractor was able to get moving. They were able to go and procure the waterproofing membrane. It's going to take time to do that. It's going to take time to install it. It's going to take time to let it dry. And as you can see here, all of this is happening on the critical path. Where do we understand that from? The accepted program. The accepted program at the date that this compensation event was notified, which is the dividing date for the purposes of this clause, shows that the concrete activity was on the critical path, and it was the path that was leading to the planned completion date. So naturally, any impact to that activity is going to have an impact on the planned completion date. And you can demonstrate that quite clearly with reference to that accepted program. If that accepted program is not in place, this is where all of the wheels come off, because the contractor then has to go and demonstrate it with a program that's never been accepted. The project manager might take a different view on that program, and under the contract, it's then up to the project manager to go and assess this compensation event. Contractor's probably never going to agree with that. Therein lies the dispute that has to be resolved by an adjudicator. You can get away from that problem by making sure that you have accepted programs in place. It's a really important lesson that I want everybody to take away from today. So as you can see here, because this has impacted our critical path, it's impacting our planned completion date by 2 weeks. What do we then do to the completion date under the contract? We move it by the same amount. And by moving it by the same amount, as we said before, that preserves the contractor's terminal float. and the contractor then still has that amount of time to deal with its own issues. Let's say if the surfacing runs over or whatever the case happens to be. But from a very simple perspective, using these blocks on the screen, that is how you assess the time impact of a compensation event. In terms of the fiscal impact, so the impact on money, the relevant clause for that is clause 63.1, and it sets out that it's all about the impact on your defined cost. And what the contract also says is that you have to look back the way on occasion, and you have to forecast on occasion. And when or where the line in the sand is there is driven here by the date of the notification. So there's a little paragraph that's not on the slide here, but at the bottom of clause 63.1 that talks about when you draw the dividing line or the dividing date. For the purposes of an instruction to change the scope, which is by far the most common compensation that you'll ever come across, it's the date that the change was instructed. So for the purposes of carrying out a forecast of the impact of this compensation event, the line in the sand is drawn at the date of the notification itself. Everything beyond that line is based on a forecast. Everything prior to that line is based on actual cost. So you do need to look at when the instruction was given to understand where that line in the sand is drawn. For the purposes of this example, it's nice and easy because it's been instructed before any of the work had to be done. So all of this work is going to be carried out on what we call a forecast basis. So you have to work out, hypothetically speaking, how much is this compensation event going to cost? You don't wait until the impact has been felt. You do it at the time, and you look to see what the impact or the forecasted impact would be. So let's start to put the manners on that in a bit more detail. The first point to note here is that there are a couple of assessment rules that you have to be aware of when it comes to making this forecast or looking retrospectively as well. And the first of those is the one that we mentioned earlier, and that's clause 63.8. And that is the fact that the contractor, in making this forecast, is entitled to include risk allowances. So what sort of risk allowances do you think the contractor might decide to make in this scenario? Again, maybe jumping back a slide. We've got an impact on a concreting activity, we've got impact on surfacing. Those sorts of activities are fairly sensitive to weather, for example. They might then decide to build in an allowance for adverse weather. I've thrown a few more on the slide here. They might decide that it would be reasonable to make a 2-week allowance for procuring the membrane because they don't know exactly how long it's going to take to get to site. If the concrete activity is now being pushed into a colder period, they might need frost mats to protect the concrete. Again, that was never allowed for originally, but it's one of those risks that might happen. There's a significant chance of happening, and therefore it will be built into the defined cost forecast. Again, membrane being poured over the winter, if they were able to do it over summer, the stuff's going to dry quickly, but because it's being done over winter, you might have to allow an extra week for the stuff to actually go off or to cure or to dry. What about suppliers being unable to hold prices? Again, big risk maybe 12, 24 months ago, where suppliers were not able to hold prices for any more than a week. Again, contractor has to take all of this risk, and therefore they are entitled to build that in to their price and build that in on a forecast basis. The final assumption is that the contractor is deemed to have reacted to this problem competently and promptly, and that is the NEC version of which most common law jurisdictions have, the duty to mitigate. So you can't just sit on your thumbs and rack up all of the prelims. You have to react competently and promptly, get the orders placed immediately, and go and get the work done without delay effectively. So all of that has to be taken into account when looking at what we're about to look at next, which is defining or working out your defined cost. So when it comes to the money aspect of this, to build upon what we looked at earlier, the starting point is to go and read that schedule of cost components line by line. If you're a commercial manager dealing with the NEC, you need to know that document like the back of your hand. It's the most important document from your perspective. And this is what it looks like. It goes in and it specifies exactly what you're allowed to claim. In a generic sense, in a qualitative sense, it gives you the words, and if what the cost you're trying to recover falls into that definition, it can be recoverable. So, for example, just to zoom in on this, you're entitled to recover the cost of people who are directly employed, so contractors, employees, and whose normal place of working is within the working areas. For example, your site foreman, your direct labour force, your site agent, for example, those people who normally work within the working areas, they can all be recovered. And the same sort of process applies to all of the other components here. It sets out a definition and you have to ask yourself, is the cost that I'm claiming falling into that definition itself? For the purposes of time and the purposes of not boring people, I'm not going to read out every single cost component here, but what I am going to do is throw up some examples for the purposes of the work example we're looking at of people that would fall into these categories. So for the purposes of our work example, we have the general labourer on the site who's going to be attending the subcontractor that is installing this membrane. You have time-related costs, your contracts manager, site engineer, quantity surveyor. Again, they might be on site full-time, they might be on site part-time. All of that is accounted for later, but the point is they are recoverable in principle because they fall neatly into these definitions. The likes of your receptionist that works in head office, he or she is not on this list, therefore they are not recoverable. They're deemed to be elsewhere, they're deemed to be within the fee. So this is a little process that you should go through for all 8 headings within the schedule of cost components. I'm not going to read out each one, but I have given you in the notes here an extract from each part of that to explain how it works. The final point that I'll mention, more so for your notes, I've highlighted as I went along here certain parts in yellow. The part that I've highlighted in yellow explains how you quantify each of these items. So for example, you've determined that you're entitled to recover your general labourer. The next thing you have to work out is, well, how much do I get for them? Under the short schedule of cost components, which is used for option A and option B, you work that out using the people rates, and those people rates will be defined within contract data part 2, and if they're not, then you have to agree upon them or the PM can set what they would be. But contract data part 2 is the starting point. So if you've got a rate for your QS, you've got a rate for your engineer, your contracts manager, you quantify that by multiplying it by the people rate. As I say, I've done the same thing for all of the other cost components here, but for the purposes of time and not boring people, I'm not going to go through each one in detail, but the same thing applies. First question is to ask yourself, is it on the list? The next question is to then quantify it as per the rules set out in the cost components. So for example, when it comes to equipment, most civil engineering contracts anyway will make reference to the CECA schedule, the Civil Engineering Contractors Association. Big schedule of rates, and it sets out if you have that schedule in your contract, you use the schedule, you adjust it accordingly, and you multiply it by the time that the equipment is needed. All of that good stuff is spelled out within the cost components. Same thing if it comes to plant and material. So if you're buying the plant and material directly, here it's based on how much you've paid. Again, I've highlighted up and where to find that. Subcontractors, a big part of this worked example is the fact that we've got a supply and install subcontract for this new membrane that we're installing. And unlike NEC3, under NEC4, you don't have to break that down. You can recover that based on the amount that you've paid that subcontractor. So you just have to prove that you've paid them that amount of money in this case. Same thing for charges. Again, here we've got the likes of an internet bill. Under NEC3, this was slightly more easy actually, I suppose. You work this out by applying a overhead percentage to your people costs. Under NEC4, you have to work it out based on payments. Again, I'll leave you with your notes to read through that. Same thing with manufacture and fabrication. So if you're constructing modular units off-site that you're going to bring in, quite a lot of M&E contractors are doing that at the moment. Again, you can recover the cost for the people putting them together based on what it says in the contract data, but none of that is relevant to this worked example. Same thing with design. So if you have to go away and do design work, again, you've got people rates within the contract data for that. Travel costs, expenses, etc. can be recovered in there as well. And then finally, I've put a bit of an explanation about this one. People do get confused about the 8th heading within the schedule of cost components. Some people think that that entitles you to recover your insurance costs. That is absolutely not the case. This is actually a negative figure. So in short, if you recover money off of an insurer and you're also trying to recover that money from the client as part of a compensation event, you would be double recovering effectively. And this part of the schedule of cost components is designed to prevent that. So the net effect is if you claim off the insurer, it's the insurer that foots the bill and it should be cost neutral to everybody else. That's what this cost component is all about. It's not allowing you to recover your insurance costs. So where that ultimately goes, and a question there, can we please share the information after the webinar? Appreciate I am running over. I will absolutely do that. They'll be shared hopefully early next week, all of these slides. So just to draw together the final couple of points, I suppose, this is what it looks like in terms of the spreadsheet. This is a spreadsheet exercise typically. You've gone through your schedule of cost components. You've worked out everybody and everything that you're entitled to recover. You have determined, based on what it says in the schedule of cost components, how to work out the money associated with that, people rates for people, equipment, and the published list for equipment, amounts paid to subbies, etc. You do the calculation, which is the easy part for most QSs, and then you go and you add it all up, and that will give you the total of your defined cost, which in this case is just over 65 grand. Final step in the compensation event process is to add on your fee percentage, which, assuming it's a straightforward 10%, added on top of that gives you your 72,000 figure. And that is pretty much how you work out the cost of any compensation event. It gets a little bit more complicated if there's varied work, if it's an extra over type exercise, but the process is the same. You work it out based on your change in defined cost. So that concludes the worked example here. We've worked out the cost of procuring the membrane, getting it installed and letting it dry. We've worked out the impact on our program, and all of that should be submitted to the project manager for approval or for acceptance as part of the quotation process. What I will leave you with is this, and these are a few hypothetical what ifs. This worked example that I've just talked through comes from a real life dispute. You might think this all seems very easy. That is because I have dramatically simplified it. And when you start to look at these what ifs, you can see how it can get a lot more complicated. For example, what if the contractor didn't early warn this design issue? Well, in that scenario, you've got a problem. You're now going to have to rip out the surfacing, rip out the concrete, put in new waterproofing membrane on top of it, reinstall it all. That's all going to have to be done retrospectively. And there's potentially, in this case, a £500,000 bill associated with that. And the first thing you have to ask yourself is, who pays that bill? Well, if the client in this case can prove that the contractor should have early warned it, then the contractor's not going to be recovering that. They're going to have to go and do all of this work. They're only ever going to be paid the 75 or the 72 that should have cost had they given the early warning. They're not going to recover the remainder of that cost. That's going to lead to a dispute. That's going to lead to lawyers. What if there's no accepted program in place? Well, then the PM has to make all these assessments itself. Contractor is never going to agree with that, 9 times out of 10 in my experience anyway. Bearing in mind, I only see these things when people fall out, so it's maybe slightly jaded, slightly one-sided. Again, lawyers getting involved. What if the new ticket machine was actually critical at the time of the compensation event? And when you're looking at all of this retrospectively, and instead of making the forecast, you're now trying to look at it retrospectively. Again, there's going to be arguments about concurrency there. There's going to be arguments about whether or not you should have made it based on a forecast. Lawyers will also be involved there. So my concluding point is that lawyers will make money in answering the questions above when the egg has already been scrambled. So to remember the point that we made earlier, you can avoid all of that by using the NEC like you should, because the NEC is designed to prevent that egg from being scrambled. Get on top of early warning, get on top of your program and deal with compensation events as you go along. That will deal with all of those what if scenarios, and it will ultimately keep the money out of us lawyers and our pockets. So 4:05, I do apologise for taking 5 extra minutes out of your day. Thank you all very much for sticking with me. If you're interested, we are running the Institution of Civil Engineers Law and Contracts Management course again this year, and we're an accredited institution for providing that. If you're interested, scan the QR, drop in your email address. All the details can be downloaded from the website, which you can access via that QR code as well. But that is us for today. You're all free to go. I'll maybe deal with some final questions if there are any. Thank you all for attending. So Andrew, I suppose if you're still there, when does the clock start ticking for the time bar for a weather compensation event? So like any compensation event, it's driven by the contractor. They start at the date that the contractor became aware of the event or should have become aware of the event. So weather's an obvious one. It's the date that the adverse weather took effect, effectively. Sean, thank you very much. Callum has got a question there regarding scope above. Okay, Callum, I'll try and scroll up. I can't see it, Callum. Could you maybe copy and paste it in again? Okay, Callum, yeah, take the physical conditions compensation event or others not working in accordance with the programme, so 6.112 and 6.15 respectively. Can the clauses contained within the scope change the portion of liability associated with who takes the risk of these CE clauses? So I think if I'm reading that correctly, instead of putting it in as a Z clause to alter the liability there, they put it into the scope, I think is the thrust of that question, Callum. And that's a question of contractual interpretation. Depends how it's written in the scope, Callum. And it's a principle of contractual interpretation that you try to read the contract as a whole in the first instance. So if there is a way of reading it that very clearly says that that risk allocation has been changed, that's probably how the courts would interpret it. The other things you'd have to look for, is there an order of priority clause? Quite often you'll see that in the form of agreement. It would normally say that the Z clauses take priority, and if they're not amending things, then potentially that could be argued as a pointer in that direction. So it's a difficult one to answer that, and unfortunately there is no black and white answer. Callum, welcome to the law. Hopefully that answers your question. I've had a dispute recently, something very similar, where NEC3, the works information, purported to add in some additional payment terms in terms of who the application for payment had to go to. None of this was mentioned in the Z clauses or clause 5, and the adjudicator in that case didn't give any weight to the scope because they were effectively saying that it doesn't trump the Z clauses in the core conditions. So, but they could have easily went the other way. So it's a very difficult one, unfortunately, to give a definitive answer to. A couple of final questions then. David Jenkinson, how would the employer prove that the contractor should have given early warning? Yeah, and that's always the response I would give from the contractor's perspective there, David. The test under clause 61.5, I think it is from memory, is whether or not the experienced contractor should have given early warning. That, strictly speaking, is what we call an objective test. So you have to step back to say, what would the hypothetical or reasonable contractor have done? And the employer would normally prove that with reference to an expert who would say, I am the reasonable contractor and this is what I would have done. But the difficulty with that, David, is the contractor could probably just as easily get an expert to say the opposite thing. So again, it is a difficult point to prove. And the important thing, David, is the burden of proof there would be on the employer. So they would be the person responsible for trying to prove it and trying to convince an adjudicator or a judge that they are correct. And the other way that I would argue that, if I was the contractor, is, well, if it was so bloody obvious, then why didn't the project manager early warn it? They are still required to early warn as well. Ergo, it was not reasonably apparent to the experienced contractor. That's how I would approach that and have done in the past. Another question from Daniel. If you have a clause 32 program, which is the revised program, with the contractor owned time risk allowance included within it, okay, have you come across successful claims where the contractor demonstrates that the client has prevented the contractor from finishing on a much earlier target due to the earlier date than the plan completion date? Not 100% sure if I follow that question. So contractors allowed TRA, it's been accepted, okay. Have I ever seen a claim where the contractor demonstrates that the client has prevented the contractor from preventing earlier? I suppose that's just like any other compensation event. You know, the contractor says, but for the compensation event, I would have finished on this date. That's probably the most common type of compensation that I see or claim that I see. So I suppose, Daniel, yes, is the short answer. I see those claims all the time. Question or a point there from Nazar, why would the contractor have to pay the 500k if the design is wrong? Well, this is an interesting point. So under clause 80.1 of the contract, that lists out additional client risks or employer's risks under NEC 3. And one of those risks is a fault in the design of the works designed by the contractor or others employed, sorry, the design of the employer or others employed by the employer. So in that case, if you could prove that it was a fault in the design, that would be the compensation event that you hinge it upon. But the overarching point there, Nazar, is that compensation event, which would be triggered if the design is the employer's problem, that compensation event would be assessed differently if the contractor didn't early warn it, and that's the key point. So if they fail to early warn it, then it would be assessed differently, and potentially the 500k that they otherwise would have got would not be recoverable because they should have early warned it, and the 500k would have been avoidable had they done that. So that's the key point. Okay, I think that's pretty much us. With one final point, Camillo, if you're still there, I don't even know if anybody is still here. Is there any difference in the time impact assessment when the planned completion date is later than the completion date? In other words, contractor's in delay? No, it's exactly the same. So if the contractor's in delay, they should be showing that on their accepted program or program for acceptance. And if there's a compensation event, that would be the trigger point for assessing the impact on the completion date. So if, let's say you're a month late shown in your accepted program, you then have a 2-week delay to your planned completion date, that would be impacted onto your completion date 2 weeks in the same way. The thing still moves, albeit your planned completion date's the other side of the line. As per the NEC, because you never know, Camillo, the contractor might be able to recover and they might be able to bring that planned completion date back early. They might be able to accelerate the job towards the end. Ganesh, as per the NEC, we need to show the completion date. Yes, you do. But in the case planned completion date moves after the completion date, how can we show it? Scheduling tools like Primavera P6, because it does not logically show it. Well, suppose I'm not a programmer by trade, but I suppose the answer is the completion date, the capital C, capital D, contractual deadline, it shouldn't be constrained by anything. I think that's the right terminology. It's just a deadline in the sand. It's a milestone that has to be met. It's the planned completion date that's constrained by the critical path that precedes it. So I think that's the answer, Ganesh. Your planned completion date constrained by the critical path. If it moves beyond the completion date, it shouldn't be an issue because this one should be an unconstrained milestone. Look at me, almost like I'm a programmer. And then finally, Camillo, basically the client cannot punish the contractor for concurrent delays. Yeah, basically, I suppose is the short answer to that. So I think that concludes everything. If everybody's happy, hopefully you got a bit of value out of that discussion at the end as well. I'm going to let you all go and thank you all very much.